Good morning and welcome to Day 2 of the Experience EDA 2020 Conference. My name is Shane Olson with Strathcona County Economic Development and Tourism and a board member with the Economic Developers of Alberta. Remember, throughout the conference day, you can share your social media posts, comments, and more using hashtag EDA 2020. Soon we will hear one of the most popular sessions each year from Mr. Todd Hirsch of ATB Financial. But first, I would like to thank our session partner, Plains Midstream Canada, for sponsoring the session today. I would like to invite up Alicia Petrulak, Specialist Communications and Stakeholder Relations, to say a few words about Plains Midstream and introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alicia Petrulak and I work for Plains Midstream Canada. Our company operates in the midstream oil and gas sector, where we connect petroleum producers to refiners and customers through pipeline, truck, and rail transportation. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's session, where you'll learn a little bit more about the economic forecast for Alberta. As a midstream oil and gas company with a large asset base in Alberta, we also have a vested interest in Alberta's economy. 2020 has been a tough year for the oil and gas sector. Through it all, Plains has been able to improve and optimize our assets, all while maintaining the health and safety of our employees and contractors. Earlier this year, we were also successful in commissioning a 50,000 barrel per day oil terminal in Midstream, Alberta. The pandemic definitely threw some wrenches into the construction when it came to procurement, securing a healthy workforce, as well as changes to our health and safety protocols. But Plains was able to muster up our can-do Alberta attitude and positively contribute to the Alberta economy and commission our terminal. We understand the commitment that EDA members have when it comes to the economic viability of their communities and the businesses in it, and Plains Midstream shares in that commitment. I'm very excited now to introduce you to Todd Hirsch, our keynote speaker for today. Todd is the Chief Economist at ATB Financial. He holds an Honours Bachelor in Economics from the University of Alberta, as well as an economic degree from the University of Calgary. For more than 20 years, he's worked as an economist for the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canadian West Foundation, and the Bank of Canada. For almost a decade, Todd also taught economics at the University of Calgary. Todd provides economic commentary for several Canadian media outlets and has been announced as one of Alberta's 50 most influential people. Todd will now provide our annual economic forecast that I'm sure will be the highlight for many of you during this conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me back to speak. It's always a great tradition to talk to EDA. I'm sad that we were not able to meet in person in the spring, but nothing about 2020 has been usual. So under these very unusual circumstances, I'm coming to you, but I do thank the organizers for including me as part of the program this year once again. The title of my presentation, What If It's Easier Than We Think? Alberta's Evolving Economy in a COVID World. Now that title is meant to be provocative. It's meant to get your eyebrows raising because certainly nothing about 2020 has felt easy for Alberta. In fact, just the opposite. It's been an extremely difficult year for so many businesses, so many towns and communities, so many individuals. A lot of difficulty in 2020. So I'm meaning to be a bit provocative when I put in my title, What If It's Easier Than We Think? The idea of adapting and evolving. Now, I'm going to set aside that concept of what if it's easier than we think for the second half of my presentation. The first half of my presentation, I want to spend going over a couple of the numbers in our most recent forecast at ATB Financial. I'm going to talk about a few key sectors in the economy, what we think will happen with those in 2021. And by the way, just a little bit of a teaser, it's not all bad news in 2021. We do have some good news. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to share 3 stories with you that highlight the idea of what if adapting is easier, in fact, than we think. So with that, let's dive into our economic outlook. Now, my economics team at ATB Financial, we do an occasional, usually quarterly outlook for the province. We have a look at our assumptions and we get out our econometric model and we put together a forecast. Now, going way back to January and February of this year, of 2020, we were anticipating releasing our forecast on March 17. And I remember that date because it was supposed to be our St. Patrick's Day release of our outlook. But of course, COVID hit, the economy shut down around March 12. We took our forecast, we crumpled it in a little ball, and we tossed it in the recycle bin because certainly nothing in our forecast was going to be very accurate with COVID locking down the economy. And probably a lot of you will remember going back to those early days of COVID, right around the middle of March. I remember when someone said, they're saying this could go on for 3 weeks. And I thought to myself, 3 weeks? There's no way the economy is going to shut down for 3 whole weeks. Well, here we are now into November of 2020. We're still living with COVID. The end of COVID, of course, is not in sight. But let's take a look at our economic outlook that we released in October. We, in fact, didn't release a forecast back in spring and summer. We waited until we had a better feel for what COVID was meaning for our economy. And our most recent forecast, we're expecting Alberta's GDP, the size of our economy, to contract by 7.1%. Now that is a bit of an eyeball-popping contraction. Certainly none of us have ever lived through a single year of contraction in Alberta of that magnitude. You really would have to go back all the way to the 1930s to find anything comparable. And because of data collection methods back in the 30s, we don't have comparable data. But certainly nothing even in the 1980s, nothing even around 2008, 2009. Not even 2015 and 2016 combined come close to the contraction that we're expecting this year, 7.1%. Now, I don't want us to get too caught up in these tenths of percentage points. I always feel uneasy, in fact, when we put out a forecast this accurate, as if we are actually able to predict within a tenth of a percentage point what the economy is going to do. So let's not get too caught up. Is it 7.1 or 7.6? All of the other bank forecasts, certainly the Government of Alberta, the Conference Board, we're all kind of in that neighborhood of anywhere between -6 and -10%. However, looking into 2021, which is only now a couple, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks away, looking into the next year, we are anticipating modest growth, 3.3% improvement in the economy. Now, this 3.3% expansion, this comes with a couple of caveats. A few conditions have to fall into place for us to see that 3.3% growth. The first condition is that, in fact, we don't see a second shutdown of the economy. Now, when I'm broadcasting this or taping this on November 4, the situation might be a little bit different when you're listening to it. But standing here in November 4, we are seeing cases in Alberta skyrocketing. At this point, we are still seeing no sign that the provincial government is wanting to re-shut down the economy. And certainly, I think everyone understands the sentiment in that. So many businesses are just hanging on by a thread. No one wants to see another shutdown or even a partial shutdown of the economy. The situation might be different towards the end of November, but our assumption at this point is that we are not going to see another broad-based shutdown of the economy now that we are in the second wave of the pandemic. The other condition, this 3.3%, is that oil prices firm up a little bit next year. Now, I'll talk a bit more in detail about the energy sector in a few moments, but at present, that West Texas Intermediate benchmark price, the US dollar price, hovering just under $40 a barrel. Our assumption is that in 2021, we see those prices firming up towards maybe that $45 or $50 barrel a range. If we don't see oil prices getting up to that range, or if we see them sliding back down into that, $25 or $35 range, we would be revising downward that forecast for next year. The other thing to say about the 3.3% expansion is that for Alberta, that actually wouldn't be a bad rate of growth. If we do see 3.3%, that will be the strongest single year we've seen in 7 years. You'd have to go back to 2014, prior to that oil price collapse in 2015 and 2016. So we are anticipating a 3.3% expansion, but the other thing to keep in mind, even if we do see 3.3%, that doesn't even get us halfway out of the hole that we're digging in 2020. So when we think about the absolute size of Alberta's economy, because growth going forward is going to be slower, and it might be a bit of stop and start as the pandemic progresses, we're not expecting Alberta's economy to get back to its pre-COVID level, the size of the economy, until 2024. So even though we are expecting that 3.3% growth next year, because the economy is actually still smaller than it was a year ago, it is still going to feel recessionary for a lot of businesses and a lot of individuals next year. The other statistic I want to share with you are forecasts for the unemployment rate. This year, we're expecting on average the monthly unemployment rate 11.4%. Now that's a discouragingly high number. It's about 2.5 times higher than where Alberta had traditionally enjoyed its unemployment rate. Prior to 2015, the unemployment rate in Alberta had been solidly around 4.5%, basically a full employment economy. We have seen elevated levels of unemployment throughout 2015, 2016, but when COVID hit, it did send that unemployment rate above 15%. We're expecting it to level out an average 11.4% this year. But even that 11.4%, as high as that sounds, it still underestimates the hit to the labor market. That 11.4%, the official rate, does not include workers who are underemployed. In other words, they might technically still have a job, but they're not working enough hours, or they may be on furlough. Their company might still have them on payroll, but they're not working, they're not receiving a paycheck. They might be receiving some of the subsidies or the emergency EI payments from Ottawa, but they're underemployed. That 11.4% also excludes discouraged workers. All of those workers who might have worked in industries like food and accommodation, maybe the energy industry, where they know at the moment there are really just no possibilities of finding work, so they've given up, at least temporarily. And if you stop looking for work, you are not considered by Statistics Canada as being unemployed. So if you add to that official 11.4%, if you add the underemployed and the discouraged workers, my estimate is that the unemployment rate in November is probably closer to 20%. And I think that level might connect a little bit more intuitively with a lot of Albertans. This idea that 1 in 5 of us is either unemployed or underemployed or discouraged in some way has been affected negatively by the pandemic. Worse news yet, 2021, even though we are expecting some growth to come back in the economy, we're not expecting the unemployment rate to fall by very much. And that's not to say it's going to be a jobless recovery. In fact, we do see some jobs coming back, but the point is there is a lot of excess capacity, a lot of slack in the labor force. Again, with that effective unemployment rate probably closer to 20%, there's a lot of underemployed and discouraged workers that have to be absorbed back into the workforce before we're going to see that unemployment rate dip back even into the high single digits. So 11.4%, 11% next year, that's a pretty discouraging level. But I do want to talk a little bit about a few key industries in Alberta. Let's start first of all with the energy sector. As I always say, this is the dog that wags an awful lot of tails in Alberta, both directly and indirectly. Pretty hard to find anybody in the province who in no way is affected by what happens in our oil and gas industry. And here the news is kind of tough, especially for oil producers. We are seeing oil prices, that $40 West Texas Intermediate, that $40 US barrel benchmark price, that is a level actually too low for most companies in Alberta, producers in Alberta, to be profitable or even break even. And of course, that $40 US price, the $35, $32, the Western Canadian Select Blend price, the benchmark for our heavy crude oils from Alberta, even lower. Now, prior to COVID, those oil prices, that West Texas price was closer to around $50, $55 a barrel. Still, by historic standards, a pretty low price, but an okay price, a price that was, promising some stability for the energy sector in Alberta in 2020. Of course, COVID drove those oil prices even to negative territory for a little bit, a couple days in April. They did bounce back, but they have stalled out around $40 a barrel. And unless we see those oil prices a little bit higher next year, I think the energy sector is looking at stable at best and probably flat to maybe even more contraction. And in October and now into November, we are hearing about more consolidation in the energy industry, which I think at an industry level is a good thing. That's what these companies are doing. They're looking for every efficiency they can find. Big mergers and acquisitions is one way to do that. The problem, of course, is that it creates an even worse situation for employment. So not great news on the oil side. However, there is a little bit better news on the natural gas side. Here we're seeing natural gas prices, they're almost double what they were even 6 months ago. Now they're still relatively low, but going from $2 to $4 for that gas, that is providing a little bit of cash flow for some of those gas producers. The ones that have spent the last 5 years or longer really getting their costs down, getting really mean and lean and efficient. And now gas prices a little bit higher. That actually is some very welcome relief to the natural gas producers. So we are seeing a little bit more optimism on that side, but certainly the oil and oil sands, conventional oils, all of that still quite a discouraging picture. I want to focus on 3 industries now where actually I'm seeing some good prospects for growth. The first is the technology and digital sector. Now, there's always been a lot of talk about the tech sector. Probably last year at the conference in Banff, I was talking about the tech sector. And every now and then, some people ask me, is this tech sector real? We keep hearing so much about the tech sector, but it's a little bit difficult to identify where it is, or it's a bit difficult, in fact, to measure it. And that is because Statistics Canada doesn't consider technology itself as a sector. Not in the same way it would regard energy or finance or real estate as sectors. Technology is a little bit different. Technology is sort of infused throughout a lot of different sectors. So it's a little bit slippery to measure. Nonetheless, we are seeing some really good growth in terms of number of tech companies and the number of jobs in technology and digital companies. So over the last 5 years, we've been seeing this grow, and where we're seeing in 2021 is further growth. Now, we always have to look at this in relative terms. We are early on as a province in growing a technology sector. It's not to say it's brand new, but we are nowhere near along the growth curve as other cities like Vancouver, like Waterloo, Ontario, Austin, Texas. These cities have been growing their technology industries for 30 years. So in Alberta, understandably, we are earlier on in that growth curve. We don't have the size of technology sector as they do. However, I do see some really good prospects for continuing to grow in that technology and digital space. The second sector where I'm really optimistic, and always have been, in fact, in my years as an economist, is in agriculture and agri-foods. Now, traditional agriculture in Alberta, if you're from Alberta, or most of you would know, the big 3, it's wheat, it's canola, it's cattle. Those 3 traditional sources of agriculture, they account for roughly 70% of farm cash receipts. On any given year, it's up and down a little bit, but roughly 70% are those 3 commodities and the one livestock. And by and large, 2020 was not a bad year for especially our crop producers, the wheat and canola. They had a nice, warm, dry autumn in most parts of the province. Harvest continued right past Thanksgiving. Now, I'd always be a little nervous standing in front of a room of farmers telling them just how good they have it, because of course, they're going to take me out around back and they're going to tell me a thing or two, in fact, about how difficult it is in agriculture. And I really don't say that lightly, because, in fact, agriculture, farming, this is not for the timid of spirit. I always say you're never more than 2 hours away from complete catastrophe, especially those crop farmers. So I don't say that lightly. However, 2020 for a lot of crop agriculture in Alberta was a pretty good year. But where I'm almost more excited is that 30% of more diversified crops. Here we're talking about some newer crops, things like cannabis. We're talking about some things that maybe aren't new but are growing very quickly, like pulses and beans and chickpeas. Things like vegetables and potatoes, things like honey production. All of these things, they make up a smaller proportion of agriculture, but they're all growing quite nicely, and they're providing more diversity to our agricultural mix. And even more exciting is the springboard from that to what we call Agri-Foods. Now we're talking food and beverage processing, which is the manufacturing extension of our agriculture. Food and beverage processing now has in fact overtaken refined petroleum. So when we think about manufacturing in Alberta and all the pieces of pie that make up that manufacturing sector, it was always refined petroleum was always the biggest piece of the pie in terms of dollars of value added, but now it is actually food and beverage. Over the last 10 years, and I'm sure all of you in your own communities and towns and cities, you can identify in every part of the province the growing presence that we are seeing of agri-food, particularly craft breweries, which are cropping up across the province, and many of them very, very good quality. But we are seeing a real growth over the last 10 years and right through COVID of agri-foods, food and beverage processing. And I think in 2021, we are going to see even greater growth. The third sector where I'm optimistic about growth is renewable energy and clean energy technologies. So here we're thinking about some traditional kinds of renewable energy, things like solar and wind, which aren't new to the province at all. But now we're adding to that really exciting industries like geothermal, like hydrogen production. Hydrogen production, not technically new for Alberta. We've been producing hydrogen for a long time, but in fact, there are now plans to really expand that. Of course, hydrogen is a real buzzword around the energy sector right now. The potential for Canada and maybe particularly Alberta to become a world leader in hydrogen production and export. Now we have to remember, when we look globally, Canada, we are a bit behind the curve on developing our hydrogen resources. But I think in Alberta, especially with the new emphasis and the new programs put out by the provincial government, I think we have every opportunity to catching up and maybe even leapfrogging some of our global competitors. So I'm excited about all three of those sectors: technology and digital, agriculture and agri-foods, and renewable energy and clean energy technologies. Now what I want to do is go back to the title of the presentation and talk about what if it's easier than we think, the idea of adapting and evolving as an economy. And to do that, I want to share with you three stories because, as if you've heard me speak before, you know that I love telling stories. Everyone loves listening to stories. So I've got three of them that I want to share with you. The first one is actually a personal story. This takes place in September and October of 2019, a little bit more than a year ago. My partner and I, we went on what for me was a vacation of a lifetime. We spent 2.5 weeks along the northeast coast of Australia, in the state of Queensland, all along the Great Barrier Reef. It was a 2,500 kilometer road trip. That last 2.5 weeks. Now, as most of you know, Australia is just ridiculously beautiful. You can hardly imagine it. But you also might know about Australia that it is full of dangerous wildlife. There are sharks that are going to chew you to bits. There are jellyfish that are going to sting you, spiders under every rock, snakes behind every corner, crocodiles that will drag you to your death. But I was not worried about, when I went to Australia, I wasn't worried or anxious about any of the wildlife. However, I was terrified of one thing going to Australia, and that is this: driving on the left side of the road. I could not in my head work out how this was going to be possible. Now, I had been in other countries like the United Kingdom, like Japan, where they drive on the left side of the road. But on those trips, I was never a driver. I was always a passenger. This trip required us to do the driving. We were renting a vehicle and doing the whole road trip on our own. And it required me to drive on the left side. But as I said, I was very anxious about this. I tried to practice this mentally in my head before we left, this idea of driving on the left side of the road with a steering wheel on the right side of the car, everything being backward. I thought it was going to feel like writing with my left hand. Because I'm right-handed, my left-hand penmanship is absolutely atrocious. And I thought if my driving is going to be anything like my left-hand handwriting, we're all in a lot of trouble. Now, I guess before I left on the trip for Australia, I had a couple of options. I could have petitioned the government of Queensland, the state we were in. I could have asked them, could you reverse the lanes of traffic just for the 2.5 weeks I'm in your country? This would be a great convenience for me. Everyone will be safer if you could just reverse it to accommodate my needs. Well, obviously that was not a viable option. Another option I guess I could have had is when in Australia, I could have just driven on the right side of the road, that felt normal to me, and dodge all of the oncoming traffic. Sort of damn the torpedoes, I'm going to drive in a way that makes sense to me. Obviously, that was not a viable solution either. The third option I had turns out to be the least viable of all, and that is I could have just, sort of hoped my partner would do all of the driving for all 2.5 weeks. And in fact, when we first arrived and flew into Brisbane, we picked up our rented SUV at the airport. And in fact, he did do the first, 3 or 4 hours of driving on the first day. But at one point, he pulled over, he said, I'm getting tired, we're going to trade drivers. I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, if you think I'm going to do all of the driving on this trip, you better rethink that. So ultimately, when in Australia, I had no choice. I had to take the wheel and I had to start driving. But once I did start driving, something amazing happened. I in fact found out it was not nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. And that proves this truism about human beings. We're amazingly adaptable when we need to be. Human beings, our default mode is the status quo. Generally speaking, we don't like change. We like just kind of keep doing the things the way we've done them. It's a more efficient way to really live. However, when we are forced into a new environment, against our will or not, when we have to adapt, we're actually really good at doing it as human beings. For me, when I was in Australia, driving did require a lot of concentration. So I don't want to give you the impression that it was just as easy as it is at home. It's not. I had to focus 100% of the time. I had to concentrate. I was probably, in fact, a safer driver there than I might be at home because you have to concentrate much more. But when you did concentrate, and once you give yourself over to the fact that this is the new environment, I found that adapting to that system was much easier than I thought it was going to be. Most of the challenge, in fact, was just in my head, anticipating how difficult it might be. Turns out it was not nearly as difficult as I thought. So that's the first story. Now you might be thinking, all right, Todd, that's an interesting story about your holiday. Do you have any examples of how an economy has maybe adapted, or maybe an example of an economy that saw a partial shutdown? Well, in fact, I do have a great example. Going back to 1973 and 1974 in the United Kingdom. At the time, as a lot of you might know, the global economy was hit with a petroleum shortage. The OPEC countries, the newly formed cartel at the time, they were withholding oil supply to global markets, which was driving petroleum prices, gasoline prices, sky high, including in the UK. And at the same time, the United Kingdom was hit with a coal miners' strike. This was causing a lot of difficulty, brownouts across the province. The government responded in several ways. They turned out every second street lamp in the whole country. They curtailed all television broadcasting had to end at 10:30 p.m. And they turned down the heat and power in all the public buildings. But the most draconian measure they took was this. They moved to a 3-day work week from a 5-day work week. And this affected everybody in the economy. Every shop, every factory floor, every office building saw a 40% reduction in the number of work hours they had available. Now, that is not quite the same sort of shutdown of the economy as what we've seen during COVID, but it is similar in the way that this was really unanticipated, very immediately a 40% reduction in working hours. That along with the coal miners' strike, and we saw a lot of adjustment very quickly in the United Kingdom. Here's a picture of some office workers working by lantern and by candlelight. But what happened during that first quarter of 1974, with a 40% reduction in work hours, you would think, doing the simple math, you would think that this would equate to a 40% contraction in the size of the economy, in output. But in fact, it resulted in only a 10% reduction in output, not 40%. Well, what accounts for this difference? Well, what happened was British workers adapted very quickly to the new environment. Very quickly they became more efficient and more productive. They sort of instinctively knew the work that they needed to get done in the 3 days that they had available, setting aside perhaps what they didn't need to get done. And they did all of this, by the way, without any warning. There were no training programs. The point I'm trying to make here is that in the economy, when we are hit with sudden, unexpected change, like a reduction in work hours, in fact, the economy and the workers in the economy are more adaptable and flexible than we maybe give ourselves credit for. The final story I want to share with you brings us back to Canada, to a very interesting sector that was also hit with unexpected change in the first decade of the 2000s. Now, this is bar and pub receipts nationwide for June 2000 to June 2010. So basically the first 10 years of this century. And in this graph, you see two very interesting periods of time. The first 5 years of the decade, we see bar and pub receipts continuing to grow quite steadily, reaching an all-time record high in early 2005. But then we hit this period. Between 2005 and 2008, we see wild volatility in bar and pub receipts. These extreme ups and downs, the bottom falls out of the floor, followed by a big spike, a resurgence in receipts the next month. Now, what was happening in this 4-year period between 05 and 08, 3 or 4 year period? Well, some of you might have already guessed what was happening. In fact, there was something very specific. During this time, Canadian provinces and municipalities were gradually introducing no smoking bylaws in the bars. This was having a dramatic effect on bar and pub receipts. Now, I was living in Calgary at the time. In 2008, Calgary was one of the last major cities to introduce a no smoking bylaw. I distinctly remember at the time some bar owners standing in front of city council begging them, please do not do this. If you introduce a no smoking bylaw in my bar, I'm going to be out of business because my smoking patrons will not come to the bar if they can't smoke. And these bar owners, they were not, they weren't making this up. They did not really believe that they were going to have a bar left if their customers couldn't smoke. But what the data tell us is something very different. That very first spike down there on that blue graph, the most extreme one, that was Toronto. That was the first major city in Canada to introduce it. And we do see a big drop in revenues, but it was followed in the coming months, the next 2 or 3 months, by an almost equal resurgence. What was happening here was that those smokers in the bar, they were just adapting to the new rules. Now, I've never been a smoker, but I can't imagine the smokers were happy about it. But they just very quickly sort of adjusted to the new rules. If they wanted to smoke, they had to step outside or go into a designated area on the sidewalk. Very quickly, they adapted to the new environment. So you see all of the spikes down as different cities and different provinces went at different times, followed by a resurgence in the coming months. This graph then tells me two things. One is that those bar patrons, the smokers, more adaptable and flexible than we gave them credit for. But the other thing this data tells me is that it would not be true to say there was no negative impact on bars. We do see that bar and pub receipts end the decade slightly below where they started. There was a negative hit to bar and pub receipts, but it was not nearly as significant as what maybe those bar owners thought it would have been. I want to end on this quote here. There's a failure to recognize that not only problems, but also solutions can grow exponentially. This is from a really great book, by the way, called Humankind, A Hopeful History. If you're looking for some good wintertime COVID reading, I would highly recommend it. It's very, very positive. It leaves you feeling good about what's coming in the future for our society. But I also love this quote because it does not negate the problems that exist. We're not sticking our head in the sand. We're not, wishing the problems didn't exist. We're acknowledging that problems can grow exponentially. And in Alberta, that is the reality. We've got a lot of problems and a lot of challenges. But our focus needs to be on the solutions, which can also grow exponentially. And this is where I want to end the presentation, talking about solutions and where our focus is as a province. In the last couple of years, maybe especially during that oil price downturn in 15 and 16, and now, of course, during COVID, I hear a lot of people say, we need to get our economy back on track. And I fully understand the sentiment in that, but it is a very backward-looking statement. It's really a nostalgia for what we thought our economy used to be. That is maybe around circa 2013, 2014, oil and gas firing on all cylinders, many Albertans, although not all of them, I would point out, but many Albertans doing very well financially. I think it's the nostalgia for those days that when people say we need to get our economy back on track, that's what they're looking at. It's a backward-looking way to view it. But you could also argue it was the track we were in 2014 that was the problem. It was an economy too dependent on one industry and one commodity, crude oil, within that industry. Then it all fell apart in 15 and 16. 17, 18, and 19 were not much recovery, and now, of course, 2020 with COVID. We can't get our economy back on track. What we need to do is forge new tracks. And that is where our focus needs to be, on the solutions. Looking forward, not looking backward. To go back to that driving on the left side of the highway in Australia, if all I was doing well in Australia is trying to get back on the right side of the road because that's what felt normal to me, I would have lost the entire vacation. We need to recognize that the world has changed on us for a lot of different reasons. Not least of all, the world's sort of complicated relationship with hydrocarbons, but also this COVID pandemic that we continue to live through. However, we can look for solutions, and if we do have that frame of mind looking forward, we will find that, in fact, adapting might be easier than we thought it was going to be. With that, I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Todd, for your presentation. We were hoping for better news, though, in terms of the economy, but perhaps bright lights are on the horizon. Your annual economic forecasts, I know, are always much appreciated, Todd, by our colleagues in the profession. Thank you for taking part in EDA. Thank you as well to Plains Midstream Canada for your continued support of EDA and for sponsoring the session today. Now, I would like to invite all of you to join us in the Zoom room for some live questions and answers. All you have to do is click on the Zoom link on your screen, and we'll see you there. Thank you.